Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our discussion of what the heck is going on in all these cities and basically in the long run, what's going on from 1848 leading up to 1914 in a lot of these different urban environments, right? So where we left off in class was talking about this guy, right? Yes, the man who has been added officially as number 5 on the body parts list, Jeremy Bentham's mummification, right? Or Jeremy Bentham's mummy, or not his, well, he is British, so he'd be like, oh, mummy. Now, like, the big thing about it, though, in general, is we talked about his ideas on utilitarianism, and his ideas on the growth of society, right? We talked about his career in pauper relief and stuff like that, but the biggest thing about it, though, is he is that contributor as a philosopher to that idea of utilitarianism. Also a very, very famous classical liberal, by the way, just to give you a heads up. I'm going to be working on those, like the spectrum, graphic organizer, classical liberal conservative, that whole thing, blah, 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 all that stuff. In the next couple days, I'll be posting that. And you also have a couple of pretty big assignments coming up to make sure that we understand that we're doing our test corrections well, and then we're also moving forward and reteaching this last unit that y'all kind of like struggled on a little bit, right? But it's not going to be a big deal. It's going to be fine. So let's keep cruising in this new unit, though, that I feel like it's a lot easier, all right? So now getting into it, though, in general, okay, we were talking about, like, that utilitarianism perspective and that idea of him coming into these cities and being like, look, we need to make, like, different ideas more accessible. We need to actually make it also so we're not, like, giving people food away on the streets anymore, da-da-da-da-da-da. But the thing about it is the people that would follow him soon after that would be known as Benthamites. And probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous Benthamite, is, of course, this guy that we looked at in class as one of the best hairlines that history has ever seen. His name is Edwin Chadwick, right? Edwin Chadwick is an English government official charged with pauper relief, okay? He actually worked on this same exact council before 1848 with Jeremy Bentham, right? While the rest of the continent is going through all these little baby revolutions, Edwin Chadwick is working with Jeremy Bentham, trying to figure out what they're going to do about pauper relief, right? But then after Jeremy Bentham dies and passes away and has his body mummified and stuff like that, Edwin Chadwick is left on one of these pauper commissions. Now, when working for the Parliament as a Benthamite, he does help create the Poor Laws of 1834. Now, the Poor Laws of 1834 do include things like ending outdoor relief, right? So, like, basically ending that thing that we talked about where, like, Katie Scuderi can run up and be like, I haven't eaten in days, and they just give her a piece of bread and she runs away out in the streets, right? Making actually more so along the lines that poorhouses are basically turned into, like, prisons. But the thing about it, though, when we're looking at it is those laws were pretty jacked up and pretty messed up, but they're very classical liberal laws, right? They're a very classical liberal law in the sense of they aren't a socialist law. Socialists would have been like, oh no, give them food if they need it, whatever, right? Classical liberals would have been like, no, let's make working seem better and being poor seem awful, right? But the thing about it, though, is Edwin Chadwick, as a Benthamite, though, did contribute majorly to European history in one huge significant way, and a lot of it has to do with waste disposal. When I say waste disposal, I don't mean trash pickup and stuff like that, which in my neighborhood happens on Tuesdays. I mean more along the lines of getting rid of all that duty that is in the streets, right? So yeah, as we talked about in the last flip and stuff like that and in the last class, there's a lot of, like, human waste lying around in these cities, right? The back-to-back housing and lack of plumbing systems and stuff like that is going to lead to an overflow of fecal matter and, like, human waste and stuff like that in the streets of these cities, okay? So the key goal that Edwin Chadwick comes into the Pauper Relief Commission with is, like, we need to figure out a way to ward off disease, right? Because the death of a wage earner in a family can basically destroy their ability to stay viable in the economy and prevent them from becoming paupers themselves, right? So the big thing he wanted to figure out is, how do we get rid of all this nasty smelling stuff? Because the thing you need to understand about Edwin Chadwick is he was one of the proponents of this idea called miasmatic theory, okay? So Edwin Chadwick, like Jeremy Bentham and many of the social scientists that came before him, believed in this idea known as miasma or miasmatic theory, where basically they thought bad smells was what actually originated diseases, right? So they also were like, oh, well, poor people get sick way more often, and all their neighborhoods smell terrible. So it must be something about this smell, right? Like that the noxious fumes of being poor cause disease. Now, the thing about it is he was wrong. Miasmatic theory / spontaneous generation or whatever is not correct. But the thing about it, though, in general, is what he tried to do to overturn miasma is still going to be very, very helpful, right? So what he wanted to do was get all that stuff out of the streets, right? And so he actually advocated for the idea of sewage systems, right? So this right here, he was like, removing waste will be 1/20th of the cost of the way that we do it now if we move all waste removal underground, right? So this right here is not one of his sewers. This right here is an ancient Roman sewer. Why do I always bring this up? To just show you that, look, the ancient Romans, shout out Miss Urso, right? The Latin kids in the house, okay? The big thing about it is the ancient Romans figured out how to, like, have a sewer dump into the ocean rather than it dumping into the Thames and causing a massive amount of waste and sewage throughout, like running through your freshwater river, right? So the thing about it is, though, is these are Chadwick's sewers, actually. They're a modernized version of it, right? They are curved along the edges, and they use subway tiles and iron pipes to remove the waste from these poorer neighborhoods. Because Chadwick came along and said, look, iron pipes and tiles are cheap. What is not cheap is paying people to go around with wagons and mules and scoop literal human feces into wagons that also might end up being dumped in the Thames and causing even more issues, right? The thing about it, though, is also he's doing all this along the lines of just believing that bad smells are going to cause people to get sick, which is so funny to me, right? So cholera is going to break out after some of his early commissions. His report actually said, we need to get rid of this stuff. We need to get rid of this stuff. And people didn't listen to him for a little while. And then a cholera outbreak happens in 1846. Right? And when the cholera broke out in Britain and then also in other parts of Europe, there were massive amounts of death tolls. Now, what cholera is an infection you get from infected water. Now, this infection in particular wants to get out of your body so it can infect more water, so what ends up happening to you is you end up going to the bathroom until you die, right? So, like, it's a lot like amoebic dysentery, but it's a different illness, right? So his report, though, after the cholera outbreak, became basis for health law in 1848. These ideas spread all over the continent. Sewage systems begin to be dug, right? They double down on it. They're like, maybe Chadwick is right. They start digging sewers, lining them with subway tiles, using iron pipes to try and get all this waste out of these cities and as far away as possible. And when sewage systems were built, look at this graph right here. As sewage systems were built, death rates began to decline, right? Why did they do this? Because things are just more sanitary now, right? It's making things better. But the thing about it is the next people that come along, the next people that come along are going to start realizing why that is, right? So now you're going to lead to the death of miasmatic theory now, right? So the thing about it, though, is Edwin Chadwick using miasmatic theory was like, if we get rid of all the noxious smelling stuff, people will stay healthier for longer. But what ends up coming around is like actually a few social scientists show up and they're like, is that correct in the sense of where the disease comes from? Because what a lot of people are beginning to realize, what a lot of scientists are beginning to realize, is that disease is coming from something. It's being caused by something, right? So you see a wave of scientists come in after the sewage systems begin to be built and being like, is it the smell or is it something else, right? And they find out that it is actually something else. One of the most famous of these scientists is a French man by the name of Louis Pasteur, who was actually a young man whenever Chadwick was doing some of his early work, whenever he was actually in the parliament. He was in his teens and stuff like that. But Louis Pasteur actually went and worked at a German brewery when he was a young man. And he realized something while looking at certain elements of yeast and other process of fermentation, like fermentating beer, underneath a microscope. And he realized that, wait a minute, there are little tiny critters in there, right? There are things in there like bacteria and all this other stuff. And he did a series of tests to try and figure out how can we kill this bacteria? Why does beer never have this bacteria and these like things that make you sick? Why for the most of history, speaking back to the Romans, why did the Romans drink wine all the time and never get sick? Reason why is because the alcohol helps kill some of the bacteria, and also in the fermentation process, you have to do what? Boil the water first, right? You have to actually boil the water and bring it to a boil so you can cook the ingredients into it before fermentation begins. So he realized that the heating of liquids kills bacteria. He basically discovered germs and proves the miasmatic theory wrong, and he invents the process known as pasteurization, which is something that all milk now must go through to make sure that there's no bacteria inside of it that can make you sick. All milk is actually boiled to a certain temperature to make it so you can ingest it healthfully, right? You got to do the same thing too. If you're stranded on a desert island, you find some water, you boil it, helps kill everything. That is a process called pasteurization. This helps leads to germ theory, right? The people begin to realize that there are bacterium and other infectious diseases inside these different little areas. But a lot of scientists have a problem with this whole thing in the sense of they're like, okay, we agree germs are correct, right? Germs are correct. Small living organisms are probably spreading disease. But how do we get enough of them in one place so we can actually analyze them, poke and prod at them, and figure out how to kill them? So along comes this guy named Robert Koch, right? Robert Koch is a German scientist who comes along and learns how to grow and culture bacteria inside of tubes, right? Like, so he actually creates one of the earliest versions of what you may call a petri dish, right? But the thing about it is Robert's, like, the tubes that Robert created are not petri dishes, because petri dishes are named after Louis Petrie, who is actually another French scientist, right? But these tubes were the earliest headliner to this entire idea of growing bacteria so I can have enough of it in one location and I can treat it with certain chemicals to see if it kills it or not, right? So this is actually going to go on to create the ideas of vaccines and antibiotics, right? To actually grow and culture the bacteria to make it so you can study them. And then along comes another man by the name of Joseph Lister. And Joseph Lister is an English scientist who created the concepts of antiseptics and sterilization. Using enough alcohol, like the Romans did when their wines and stuff like that, could actually clean certain items, and his ideas are going to be used to clean surgical tools. So we don't have a like Louis XIV problem anymore, where you get an infection on that like fistula you have in your, where he had it, and we don't have to worry about that anymore. No one's getting gangrene. People are not dying from as much surgery as they used to, right? Joseph Lister used a lot of different chemicals and alcohol, like substitutes and stuff like that, to actually cleanse these different devices and create these different things called antiseptics. It's why you know this very famous product, because it's named directly after him.
Did you know that brushing your teeth only cleans a quarter of your mouth, whereas Listerine cleans your whole mouth and kills up to 99.9% of bad bacteria? It penetrates plaque deeper than any other everyday use mouthwash, so there's nowhere for bacteria to hide. There's no deeper clean than Listerine.
Exactly. That stuff is named after Joseph Lister, hence Listerine, right? So now, like, going forward as well, this is going to lead to the drop-off of diphtheria, typhoid, typhus, cholera, yellow fever are going to slowly begin to disappear, because scientists are now making great strides in the analysis of disease and how it works, right? So now another big thing is going to come along, though, is as we're digging these different pipe sewage systems and all these different things are happening, and people are beginning to look at cities and begin to be like, maybe we have this all wrong. Maybe cities are designed incorrectly, and we need to actually do this in a little bit of a different way and in a little bit more of a positive way. And the best example of this new urban redesign is going to be in none other than France, under the new rulership of their president, Napoleon III, right? Napoleon III comes along, Louis Napoleon, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, comes along and says, you know what we could do? I am in the wake currently of the Revolution of 1848. A lot of crazy stuff went down, right? I'm now president because of it, but also during the June days, I had to shoot like 10,000 people, right? What can I do to earn the respect of the poor and the classical liberals and the middle class, okay, like classical liberals, aka middle class, the socialists and the workers? What can I do to re-earn their respect? I need to create something that will not only give them a more beautiful place to live in, but will also give them work, right? So Napoleon embarks on the idea of creating a revitalized France, right? A revitalized France based off of Paris. So he actually wants to create public projects that will be used to aid and employ the poor. He's like, look, let's build more roads. Poor people need work. Poor people can build roads. Roads get built. Bang, bang, bang. Roads benefit the classical liberals because their product can now be moved easier over the roads. Roads get they start selling more items, more taxation, more utilitarianism, right? So he wants to create this early form of basically a welfare state, right? Creating jobs directly to benefit the people from government-funded programs. And so what does he want to do, though? The problem is that Napoleon doesn't have any experience as an architect. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know how to design roads so they make sense, or where to put these sewage pipes and stuff like that. So he hires a very important figure, a man by the name of Baron Georges Haussmann, right? So yeah, Georges Haussmann is actually half French, half German. He's actually descendant of the area known as Alsace-Lorraine, right? So like now, the thing about it is he is a government official hired by Napoleon III to remake France, right? Remake France, rebuild particularly the city of Paris. After the June days and after the shootings and after the barricades that were built all over the place, rebuild this city as a pristine example for other Europeans to copy, right? So he was employed creating the Paris that you know now, right? So the big thing about it that you have to understand is that Paris was very gross. And this right here is Baron de Haussmann, the man himself, in a very good photograph. That right there is what Paris looked like before the Haussmann reforms. Look how crammed together the buildings are. Look how small and narrow the roadways and alleyways were. This is like a canal that literally the only way to cross it is this little footbridge right here. And also this little waterway is probably filled with human waste, right? Look at the buildings on either side of it. This is another big reason why the revolutions of 1848 were so successful, because you can build a barricade over that very, very easily, right? Also, this is a slum on the outside of Paris and stuff like that. That right there is a picture of the June days. Look at those barricades built across these narrow streets and stuff like that. Cobblestones everywhere that don't make any sense. Haussmann comes along and says, no, we will build grand boulevards that are massive interstate commerce ideas to move product quickly and easily, and also give people tree-lined streets to walk by as they're on their way to work, right? Invoke the idea of beauty and serenity and commerce and beautiful pastel equal level buildings all over their fair cities, right? And the other big thing about it too is like when you're Napoleon III, you can march your army down these big old roads for giant military parades, and good luck building a barricade that's that friggin' long. That's another little kind of thing about an ulterior motive that Napoleon III had with this whole thing. If the streets are too wide, can't make a barricade, can't have any revolutions like that ever again. So the thing about it though is they rebuild all these cities in this style, and they create these gorgeous pastel colored fronted cities. And this literally is like the model for European cities now completely. Most cities in Europe have a restrict area or a strict number of floors that they can build up to, and most of the buildings are all exactly that height and have these gorgeous, gorgeous pastel fronts. And this right here is the Paris of today, right? With its giant boulevards, its tree-lined streets, its parks and public places, and all these different other ideas, and it's, of course, gorgeous Ring Boulevard, right? So that all is actually related to the Baron de Haussmann reforms. He rebuilt all these things. He destroyed those old buildings to create huge, broad, street-lined, big tree-lined streets that created better flow, demolished slums, and he also knocked down these really old, medieval fortress walls. So, for a long time in the Middle Ages, most cities had a wall that actually went around the exterior of it. This is actually related really interesting to the history of New Orleans due to the fact that New Orleans actually originally had a wall that went around it because they actually used that old medieval idea. And that's why Rampart Street is actually up at the top of the French Quarter, because that's where the wall used to be, because Rampart means wall in French. But the thing about it though is after all that, Baron de Haussmann comes along and realizes that having buildings or having walls around your city doesn't really make any much sense and kind of chokes off commerce and stuff like that. He actually has those walls knocked down and creates these really beautiful ring boulevards that can be used to travel the cities much more effectively and much more easy. And that right there is called the La Pétale, and it literally went around the internal area of Paris, and you can still travel on it today, which is absolutely wild, right? So also he wanted to create parks, open areas, sewers, aqueduct systems to bring in fresh water, public transportation, which is huge, by horse carts early. But by 1890, start breaking out electric streetcars, bananas. All right, so the thing that you need to understand, though, is that Haussmann created the cities in France. Sorry, I had to skip over a couple things real quick and jump over to this, all right, because we've got another little ism that's about to pop up that we got to talk about, all right? So the ism that we're now moving into is none other than feminism. All right, so yeah, another ism is popping up during this time period, known as feminism. And you can actually see the evolution of feminism, which I think is really, really cool, in the progression of women's fashion. Look at fashion during the late 1700s when it was giant and huge and a giant buttress thing that wasn't really built for women's comfort and stuff like that. So much so that literally they had to use one of these to go to the bathroom during these major parties and stuff like that. We'll talk about what that is in class. It's called a bordaloo. And then look at the late 1800s fashion, moving in the direction of functionality, because women are becoming more of an ever-present motivator and a large-scale thing in society. And so with the rise of feminism being very important during this time period, this could all be exemplified by a couple of sisters that actually did a really good job by writing very realistic, realistic novels about the roles of women in society. So another big thing that's going on in the background during this time period is actually a thing known as the realist movement, or realism, by trying to actually show active society in realistic linguistic culture, okay? Women are beginning to take a more prominent role, and you can see this in the realistic writings of the Bronte sisters, right? The Bronte sisters are very, very famous for writing several books like Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, which portray women as strong focal figures in society that may have work. make decisions for themselves and beginning to do all these other major important roles and activities within society. So the thing about it, though, is now granted, separate spheres of work still existed during this time period, and we always got to kind of keep that in mind, which is garbage and dumb. And this especially affected the lower class because it's not like women could just strike out and be like, oh, no, I'm going to go doing this. They had to do certain things to take care of their kids and stuff like that. But the rigors of the separate spheres of work are beginning to dissolve away, okay? Women are beginning to make more money, and a lot of it is because some of these lower class women and some of these middle class women are beginning to participate in these things called the sweated industries, right? Where working class women would sometimes make money by doing hand items at home because certain devices are beginning to come out. For example, like the Singer sewing machine. They could actually take in things, hem them, do simple work while they're also watching their kids at home. These sweated industries lead to women making more money. And if they're making more money, they're taking a more active role in society. And by the late 1800s, women's rights organizations are beginning to pop up because rigid gender roles are beginning to make them angry. Now, one of the biggest things that does pop up in the late 1800s as well is the beginning of a women's suffrage movement. One of the best examples of this is these women known as the Pankhurst family that we'll talk about a little bit later. We get into the 1900s and as we bridge the gap into World War I, because they were actually very, very famous for leading very large suffragette marches and demanding the rights to vote for women, okay? So as we can tell, the big thing about it is as women are beginning to take a more active role in society, they are actually beginning to be more prominent and demanding certain rights for themselves. This right here is a famous political cartoon that actually came out in New Zealand of trying to show, oh, how this is going to be terrible. Because look at this man who's now doing all of the home activities and this woman who's coming in with all of like the idea, like with all of her money and all of her aggression and stuff like that. So ironically enough, a large number of men protested this women growing in society role, which is really messed up and super, super sexist, all right? So the thing about it, though, is, as you need to know, in the late 1800s, feminism is on the rise, okay? And the other thing about it that we're going to start talking about in class tomorrow is the growth of thermodynamics and also the growth of the Second Industrial Revolution. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.